Jeanette, I'm just so sorry about your daughter's loss. I can't even imagine what that must be like. So I will be putting you on my prayer list and thinking about you during this time. And then the family, was it Livingston's that have the twins? No, that's the wrong one. That's where they were sitting on my screen a minute ago, but where did the family go with they don't have to put it back.
It's Louis with the waterfalls.
Okay, all right. Well, I have twins as well. I have a son and a daughter, and they're going to be 30 this summer, but I remember 13, and we had great fun. So it's always nice to know other families with twins. So the other thing I have to share before I talk about Loma Linda has to do with Betty's song. So I'm so glad you sang that song, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. So I grew up in a family that was very musical. My parents met each other in college when they were both music majors. Now they both switched and graduated with other degrees, but they were both fabulous musicians. And so I grew up, all through my growing up years, we would sing together as a family. And we did a number of programs. We recorded a lot of songs for 3ABN. And so when I was 16, we had been invited to kind of do a tour of the United States. And my parents thought that it would be wonderful to just rent a motorhome and we would travel across the country. Well, the motorhome that we happened to rent had all kinds of problems. And in the 6 weeks that we were gone, it broke down 17 times. Now, one of those times was in the middle of a mile-long tunnel in Zion National Park at pitch dark. And here we were stopped in the middle of it. But we had all these episodes where the motorhome would just break down. Well, we were on our way to Texas to give a program on a Sabbath afternoon. So I think it must have been Thursday. And we were driving through maybe New Mexico, I don't remember. But it was flat, dry desert. And I was sitting in the back doing some crocheting and looking out the side window, and we hadn't seen anything for miles. And all of a sudden, this motorhome started to sputter and stalled. My dad couldn't get it to start again. We were just kind of all like, what are we going to do now? And I turned around and looked out the back window from where I was sitting, and we had stopped right in front of 3 houses. And there was a sign in front, and it was the highway maintenance crew that lived out there because they were so far from any towns that they had to put people, in the middle of the desert to take care of the roads. So my dad went up to one of the houses. He just chose one of the houses and knocked on the door. And the lady who came to the door said, "Oh, my husband, he'll be home in about an hour. He's a great mechanic. He'll be able to help you. But why don't you come inside while you wait?" Because it was very, very hot. So we all went inside, and the first thing we saw was a piano. And my dad said, "Oh, who plays the piano?" And she says, "Well, I'm kind of a little bit of a musician. I've always enjoyed music." And he said, "Well, we're on our way to perform a program in Texas, and we were planning to practice when we got there. Would you mind if we just did a little practice here?" And she says, "Oh, I would love that." She says, "I never get, music." So the very first song on our family program that year happened to be an arrangement of Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. So we started singing, and immediately tears just started streaming down her eyes. And when we finished, she just came over and she grabbed my mom by the shoulders. She says, "Do you know She says, I used to take voice lessons from the lady who wrote that song. And she said, you need to know that she was blind. And we were just so moved and so amazed at how God had worked, through all of the crisis. And even though we had to break down, that we broke down right in front of a home where we were able to minister and she was able to minister to us. So that's my little story on Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. Thank you, Betty. Now I'll tell you a little bit about Loma Linda. I have worked at Loma Linda since 1983. I was a student at Walla Walla College in Washington and was taking elementary education, and decided during a student missionary year in Indonesia that maybe what I should do is take nursing. And so I transferred after I had taken 3 years of college at Walla Walla. I came down to Loma Linda as a nursing student in 1981 and graduated a couple of years later and took a job on the oncology unit, adult oncology. So I worked with cancer patients for a number of years and absolutely loved it. Then when I was pregnant with our twins, my husband got a fellowship up in San Francisco. And so we moved away for 5 years. And when we came back, I had not done nursing, floor nursing for that time. And so I felt like I probably needed to find another career path. And I was invited to take a job working with the bereavement programs at the hospital. And that role was part of a position called nursing spiritual care. And over the next 6 or 8 years, that role expanded and became a position of taking care of the spiritual health of our employees, as well as teaching our employees how to provide spiritual care to our patients and to each other, how to care for each other. And so I went back and got a pastoral degree because my career path was moving more into ministry. And it was actually something that I had very, very strongly considered when I was in college. At that time, women in ministry were not well accepted, and I didn't feel like I was up to the fight. The people who were going into it were really needing to take a strong stance, and I just didn't have it in me. And so I didn't follow that at the time, although nursing was a career path of ministry. So now I serve an organization that has about 18,000 employees. Now, about 5,000 of those, I think, are on the university side, and the rest are part of the health system. And so my role is confined to the health system. And we have 5 hospitals. We have the main medical center and the children's hospital, which are actually physically connected. They're on the same campus, but they have different licenses. And then we have an East Campus Hospital, which is about 1 kilometer down the road. And it has about 120 beds, I think. And our rehab hospital is there. And then a little further to the east from that, another couple kilometers, is the surgical hospital, which is a small hospital. They do a lot of outpatient surgeries as well as urology and GYN surgeries. And then we have our behavioral medicine center, which is a little bit further east. And then down to the south, I'm not going to do well with kilometers. It's probably 100 kilometers. Is our Murrieta Hospital, and it's the newest connection to Loma Linda that was built maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And they've been very, very busy. Loma Linda is in a different county than the Murrieta Hospital. That's in Riverside County, and Riverside County has been hit a little bit harder by the COVID pandemic. And so Murrieta Hospital has been extremely full. They haven't had beds for a number of days. You know, they'll discharge somebody and somebody immediately fills that bed. So what else do you want to know about Loma Linda? Anybody have questions? We have 8 schools in the university. I'll see if I can remember them all. There's the School of Medicine, Dentistry, Nursing, Public Health, Allied Health, which has physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, religion, and behavioral health. Oh dear, I forgot one. Pharmacy is the last one, and that's the newest one.
Now, with the children's hospital, how many beds do you have in the children's hospital?
There are about, let me see if I can remember this right, a little over 300. The neonatal intensive care unit itself has 100 beds. They have 300 employees. It's like as big as many, many hospitals, or bigger than many hospitals. And we often have 90 to 100 little babies. We're the referral center for a very, very large area. So if you go west from Loma Linda toward Los Angeles, it's very, very populated. And in toward Los Angeles, there are several children's hospitals. But if you go east, or if you go north from Loma Linda, it's quite rural. And so you can drive 6 hours north from Loma Linda, and you're still in our territory as far as the referral center for the children's hospital. And so we get babies that are helicoptered in on a regular basis. And so our children's hospital serves a very, very large area.
How many Adventists would you say live in the area?
You know, I told you earlier, I think there are probably 30 or 40 churches within a 20-mile radius of Loma Linda. So I'm going to take a wild guess and say 15,000. I don't know, maybe more. You have Loma Linda University Church has 6,000 or 7,000 members. I know of 4 other churches, so Calamasa, Azure Hills, Campus Hill, and La Sierra and Redlands, those 5 that all have more than 1,000 members. And then there are many, many ethnic churches. So there are several Spanish churches, and Indonesian, Korean, Filipino, Japanese, Middle Eastern, just lots and lots of churches. And the huge spectrum. So we have churches that are very conservative. You'll never see a guitar in them, or a drum set. And you have other churches that have flashing lights and smoke and all the drama every week for their music.
The hospital, I understand that there's only 2 that are non-governmental hospitals or something that are tertiary, or is that wrong?
I don't believe that's true. I guess I don't even know that what the question is.
Okay.
We don't have, so there are some county hospitals throughout the United States, but most of our hospitals are privately owned or nonprofits.
Oh, okay. All right. I don't know if there's anybody that's got a question that you would like to ask, or after you've chatted, maybe you could answer a few questions then.
Of course.
But I have to say, before we asked Sherilyn to pray, that from the minute I chatted to Kathy, she was so helpful and she wanted to come. She almost I think she feels this is like a missionary trip. She's never seen such a small church in her life. So from the few people here, we want to welcome you. We want to say thank you that you put aside some time to be with us. And we know that the Lord uses people like you in specific positions like that. So I suppose you've got tons of testimonies you could give of people that you've prayed with and spoke with and introduced to Christ. But Sherilyn, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind opening with prayer. And just to be different, Cliff, would you close with prayer at the end of the meeting? If you can unmute yourself, Sherilyn.
Let's close our eyes. Our Daddy in heaven, we thank you for the gift of the Sabbath, and that very soon we'll be entering the millennial true Sabbath rest. Father, we thank you that while we are holding on for that promise, that you are the comforter to those who have lost loved ones as we hold on to the hope of the resurrection. We thank you, Lord, that you are the great physician for those amongst us who are fighting disease, and that you are the great provider for those who have lost employment and income. Father, tonight our prayer is a prayer of thanks that Kathy has come to share the word with us, and our prayer is that you will touch her heart and mind as she turns our eyes upon Jesus. This we humbly ask in your beautiful name, amen.
Thank you so much, Sherilyn. Well, it is really wonderful to be with you. I have been a part of a small church myself when we moved to San Francisco. There were about 50 people a week that were attending that church, and it was a very special time in our spiritual journey as a family. My topic today is hope rising. A friend of mine, Shelley, lost her job recently. She was the victim of COVID. Her business was downsizing and her job was considered non-essential. So after 22 years with the same company, she found herself without work. She had moved years ago from another state to take this job. And so now she was away from family. She is single and had no way to support herself. Her future looks a little bleak. The severance package that she got only gave her enough money to survive for a couple of months, and yet she has a house to pay for. She needs health insurance. She needs to buy groceries. So to anybody looking on, they might say that Shelley is suffering, but she has hope. I want you to listen to part of an email that she shared with me. She sent this to her colleagues the last week that she was working. She said, "We cannot see clearly what is ahead, but He knows. He is near, and I know that no matter what tomorrow brings, I can put my trust in Him. He promises to be our help, and He has a future in mind for me." I said to her, I said, "Shelley, how do you have so much hope?" And she says, "Oh, Kathy, God has promised a hope and a future, and I stand on that promise. That is my foundation. When hard times come, I'm human and I grieve, but I know that He has a plan. He has been preparing my heart for change, and I want to glorify Him. That's what matters." I love that testimony. Shelley has a vibrant love for Jesus. She happens to attend another denominational church, but she knows and loves God. And she has been a witness to me on many, many occasions. We're going to talk about how hope can arise from suffering. However, I think it's important to name the fact that hope doesn't always arise from suffering. While the worst suffering that we know of, the cross, led to the most hope, sometimes suffering doesn't result in beauty or hope. And as followers of a God who we know is good, that can sometimes be unsettling or confusing and can lead to doubt. You see, in the same way that rain can cause a landscape to flourish, or rain can send floods and cause tremendous destruction, suffering can produce experiences that we don't understand. And so I come to today's text very aware that I don't have all the answers. What has been the cause of the most suffering in your life? When you were a child, maybe it was the fact that you didn't get the birthday present that you wanted, or a friend got sick and couldn't come to your birthday party. Maybe you suffered because you got sent to your room without dessert when you didn't clean your room. As teenagers, we suffer sometimes from depression or an eating disorder, or we suffer because we're grounded by our parents. We suffer when we experience the death of a parent or grandparent or a dear friend. Sometimes when we go through a breakup or bullied by a friend, by people who are not our friends. Suffering can take so many forms. Chronic pain, loneliness, debt, chronic self-esteem, low self-esteem, or not getting the promotion that you wanted at work. Just like rain, sometimes difficulties in our life can lead to flourishing growth, or it can lead to devastation and despair. As painful as these things can be in our lives, I think it's worth noting that compared to the suffering of much of the world, many of these types of suffering are different. In a sense, they're first world problems. Most of us have plenty of food. We have freedom to worship the way that we want. We have not been victims of terrible events that have happened. But our suffering is still real. It is painful. And to each person, our suffering is unique. So our text today comes from Romans 5, 1-5. It says, therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And then it gets a little tougher. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. Now, whenever a text starts with therefore, it's important to know the context. And early in the chapters of Romans, Paul is talking about the power that sin has had over humans. This is where the famous text comes from that says, all have fallen short of the glory of God. But then Paul announces God's response to our plight. He says, because of Jesus, now we are justified by God's grace, just like Abraham. Now, justification is a big word. I had a friend who recently told me a definition of it that I loved. He said, justification is being made right with God through faith in Jesus. Justification means we're cleared of blame. We are declared holy by God. Now, once in a while, we get an earthly example of what that might be like. When I was in college, I was with a group of friends one day, and the name of one of my other friends came up. And some of the people in the room said things about her that were not very kind. And I sat there and knew that they were not true, and I was uncomfortable about what was being said, but I didn't say anything. And afterwards, I felt horrible. I felt even worse when I learned that she had heard about the conversation. She was terribly hurt, and I went and apologized to her, and we shed tears together. But I have to say that whenever I saw her after that, I was kind of nervous. I felt like I had let her down so badly. Well, it was one of those friendships that I didn't keep in touch with. We had been kind of casual friends, but I didn't see her for a number of years. And then one year I went back to my home state of Oregon for camp meeting, and across the crowd, I saw her. And I have to say, the first instinct I had was I wanted to turn around and run the other way. But she had seen me, and she waved, and she came running toward me, gave me a big hug, and we chatted and talked, and she just seemed so happy to see me, but I could not get this knot out of the pit of my stomach, because that's all I could think about was how I had let her down. And finally I said something. I said, you know, I still feel badly about what happened at Walla Walla. And she looked at me and she says, what are you talking about? And I tried to remind her of the situation, and she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't remember that at all. Now, if a person can extend that kind of grace to us, can justify us, how much more does God cover our sins and see us without blame? So the good news in this text is that we have been declared holy. And because we start that way, we can be assured that we're going to end that way. We start righteous, we're going to end righteous. It's similar to someone who knows how to swim, who jumps into a swimming pool. And we know that that person is going to make it to the other end of the pool because they're a swimmer, right? Unless they choose to head over to the side of the pool when they're partway through, they're going to make it to the other end. Now, if a non-swimmer jumps into a pool, we don't know. You know, they may try, they may make it part way, but it's going to take place with lots of fear and effort. And this is what Paul wants us to know at the starting point for this discussion. We are right with God. We've got a long ways to swim, but we're going to make it to the other end of the pool because we have been justified. All right? So even though God saves us, sin remains. Suffering is present. And so then Paul gives us this challenge. He says, we rejoice in our sufferings. That's always seemed a little bit of a difficult text. But Paul is not saying we rejoice because of our sufferings. We rejoice in the midst of them. See, suffering doesn't produce rejoicing, but it can't kill it. All right? God is not some sadistic being who's up in heaven who enjoys watching us suffer. He is ultimately in the business of eliminating suffering in this world. But while doing that, we have to face difficulties. Our loved ones die. We face pandemics. People say things about us that aren't true. Our relationships suffer. We face financial ruin. We get diagnosed with cancer. Through the last 15 years or so, I have come to know and appreciate a friend from church named Donna. She has had a significant amount of suffering in her life. She was once a pastor's wife before he left her for another woman when they had 2 teenage daughters. She moved from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast because her mother was suffering from dementia, and she spent the next number of years caring for her mom as she went downhill before her death. She has started her own neurofeedback practice, but she struggles financially. She is not on solid ground, I would say. And now with COVID, she hasn't been able to work. And I talked with her a few weeks ago. I said, how in the world do you find joy? Because she is a joy-filled person. I said, how do you find joy? And she talked about how God has proven himself over and over in her life. In times when she has felt the most abandoned, when her husband left her, she said, God showed up in very real ways. Donna said, he has become my constant companion in ways that I never felt before. Just like Paul says in Romans 8:28, we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. He doesn't cause the pain, but he works in it to bring good. Maybe you've had that experience too. Well, as we move on in the passage, we see this progression. There's kind of a formula that Paul puts forth. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. It's kind of like this. My husband and I are gardeners. We've got quite a large garden and about 38 fruit trees. In February, we planted tomato seeds. And then when they were up about this high, they had sprouted and they'd grown a little bit, we cut the tops off and we grafted those onto other rootstock of tomatoes because we have a lot of trouble with disease here and we like to do organic gardening. Then when they were a little bit bigger, we transplanted them into plastic cups, and then they got a little bigger and we transplanted them into bigger pots. And then in May, we set them out in our garden. And we fully expected to get tomatoes because we planted tomato seeds, and last week we picked our first ones. All right, so there's something about this where Paul says it's predictable. If you have suffering, you're going to learn endurance and you will develop character and you will have hope. It's not always obvious to us who are going through it. But I want to look a little more closely at those words that are in that sequence. Suffering is the starting point. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, back in 1978, Scott Peck wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled. And it had one of the most memorable first lines of a book that I know of. Life is difficult. That became kind of a famous saying in the United States through that time. It's true. Life is difficult. That's where we start a lot of times. The Greek word for suffering is thalipsis. And it means pressure or to compress. It's actually the word that's used when they talk about making grape juice, where they're going to press the grapes, the lipsis. It's also the same word that's used in John, where Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulations, but take heart, I have overcome the world. In this world you will have thlipsis, you will have sufferings. Now, sometimes we know suffering can be a motivating factor, right? If you are a student and you have a deadline to write a paper for school, that is going to create some suffering in your life, and it will help to get you moving. If you have a heart attack, that suffering can motivate you to make a change in your lifestyle. So we know that sometimes suffering can lead to good that way. But Paul says that suffering will lead to endurance. When I was in college, I spent a couple summers working at a youth camp, a Christian youth camp in my home state of Oregon. And they would have all of the staff members come to camp 2 weeks before any campers came, because there was a lot of work that had to be done. And one of the things that everybody dreaded the most was that this huge dump trucks, load after load after load, would be dumped in the parking lot. And it was wood chips. And we had to take wheelbarrows and fill the wheelbarrows with wood chips and take them and cover the entire camp because it was so dusty otherwise. Now, I happen to have grown up with a father who believed in manual labor. So I had done many a load of chicken manure on our family garden. But there were people there who had never held a shovel in their hands. And I will tell you that, they developed blisters and aching muscles, and they were in pain. But they developed some endurance. After they had done that for a week, they got stronger and they were able to do it longer, because suffering can toughen us up a little bit. So endurance is this doggedness or perseverance. It takes endurance to run a marathon. I don't know if any of you have ever done that. I have not, but my father and my husband and my daughter have. People talk about hitting the wall when they run a marathon. It's like their mind goes on cruise control while their hamstrings and glutes and their heart are using more and more resources every mile. Now, when they hit the wall, they need physical refueling. But there also has to be this conversation between the mind and the body. Like, you knew this was going to be hard. You prepared for it. You can do it. You can do hard things. And when the mind makes that shift, I am told, then they can complete the race. That's the endurance. Suffering can spur us on. It can make us stronger. It can increase our endurance. It allows us to go beyond what we thought we could ever do. So then Paul goes on to say that the combination of suffering and endurance leads to character. Now, character is not inherited. It comes through experience. Our personality is in our DNA, but our character is learned. The Greek word for character is charasign, and it means to engrave or cut in furrows. There's something significant about that our character is ingrained in us. It's part of who we are. It's the attributes that determine our moral and ethical reactions. It's who you are at the very core of your being. Now, I want to ask you a question that may seem completely unrelated. If you were to represent your life as a painting, what colors would be on your canvas? Would you have a palette of bright, happy colors? Or would they be kind of dark and foreboding? Or maybe you would have both. You see, sometimes the way that we remember things changes over time. So a period of time that might have seemed very dark in your past might seem less painful when you look back on it. And why is that? Because we make meaning. We learn lessons from what we've been through. We build character. Where is it that you've learned the most in your life? Even as a child, I would have to say that for me, it came from hard times. I learned generosity when my father strongly suggested that I share my favorite doll with a family who was visiting. They were missionaries in South America. And I gave it to her, and it was very painful. But when I look back on it, I realize how much I learned from that. I learned about resilience when my cat died. I learned about honesty and tact as I had conversations with friends in high school, some of which were painful conversations. I learned about trusting God through years of infertility. Those were all painful times, but growth came out of them. So Paul never imagined that we would have a life without problems. He knew, because he had been persecuted, he had been criticized, he had been imprisoned. So he said, it's not what happens to us, but how we let God use what happens to us. God will shape our character in the midst of life. He will grow us in the middle of pain. But then as we near the end of the chapter, we get to the real kicker, because the ending point of the passage is hope. Hope is not the expected outcome of suffering. It is clear that when I plant tomato seeds, I plan to pick tomatoes. But when I face suffering, hope is not the crop I expect to harvest. I want to read verses 3-5 again from the J.B. Phillips version. This doesn't mean, of course, that we have only a hope of future joys. We can be full of joy here and now, even in our trials and troubles. Taken in the right spirit, these very things will give us patient endurance. This in turn will develop a mature character, and a character of this sort produces a steady hope, a hope that will never disappoint us. Character produces a steady hope. It is unwavering. Character is that distinctive quality that identifies who we are at our core. And when we have character, we will have hope. It implies that it's a natural result of character growth. For the last year and a half, I have been praying for a friend of mine named Grace. She's a young mother who was diagnosed Thanksgiving time of 2018 with a very rare malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumor. There's only a few hundred people in the world who have had it. She's undergone radiation, which caused terrible burns in her esophagus. She couldn't even eat or swallow without terrible pain. She's had chemotherapy, which sapped her strength, and all kinds of side effects. And now she has been told that there is no cure for her cancer. And yet those of us who know her as a woman of hope. When I talked with her not long ago, she talked about how completely weak she had been physically. And yet, because of God sustaining her, she felt stronger in some ways than she had ever felt before. It's another paradox that Paul talks about. He says, when I am weak, then I am strong. But it's not in our own strength, it's God's. Because God says, my power is made perfect in your weakness. And that is reason for hope. Joseph dealt with many physical problems in his life. An accident when he was in his 30s had caused a great deal of suffering. And by the time he was in his mid-50s, he had had to have one of his legs amputated. It turned out that he had developed a fatal infection as a result of that surgery. So his pastor came to visit him in the hospital just a few days before he died. And they talked about his life and his accident and his infection. And Joseph told the pastor, I never would have chosen one of the trials that I have gone through, but I wouldn't have missed any of them for the world. I never would have chosen one of them, but I wouldn't have missed any of them for the world. He understood that suffering had given him endurance, which had built his character and ultimately given him a steady hope that did not disappoint. And that is our hope. God promises that he will bring good out of suffering. He will make us strong. Thank you.